Well, good morning and welcome to today's webinar on cleaning for COVID-19. This has certainly been a topic that's had an enormous amount of interest in, and people have a large number of practical questions of how to manage a workplace or a site after there's been an actual or a potential exposure to COVID-19. We have a great panel assembled together today of both people who bring a scientific knowledge to the discussion, people who bring a practical application from the organisation, and also some thinking about how to actually respond in ways that actually facilitate appropriate levels of cleaning after COVID-19 exposure. It's great to be able to welcome the panel today. So I'll have the next slide, please. And on behalf of the Australian Institute of Health and Safety, I'd like to welcome you along with Art of Work. And we're really pleased that you've been able to join today's webinar. We've received a large number of questions, and Rod Cameron, one of the members of our team, is going to put questions to panel members as we start. So we have Dr. Greg Whiteley, who's the chairman of Whiteley Corporation. We have Dusty Bennett, who's a principal hygienist with GCG Hygiene, a special organisation in this space. We have Rochelle Mott, who's the Group Health and Safety Manager for Woolworths. Jamie Ross, who's with Spotless, as the Head of Zero Harm Risk and Systems. So it's great to warmly welcome you today. Next slide, please. You'll be able to ask questions and we'll respond to these questions. But what we've also done is we've curated a number of questions that we've received, which Rod will be able to ask the panel directly today on your behalf. Next slide, please. Well, it's great to be able to welcome Dr. Greg Whiteley. Greg is the chairman of Whiteley Corporation, and he's also the adjunct fellow at the School of Medicine at Western Sydney University. Whiteley Corporation is a leading Australian company in research and the manufacture of innovative hygiene, cleaning and infection control products. So let me hand over to Greg. Warm welcome, Greg, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts on cleaning for COVID-19.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you to the Art of Work team and the Australian Institute of Health and Safety. If I could go to the next slide, that'd be great. And there's a bit about me, but you can read that later. That will, I'm sure, help you to sleep tonight. If we move to the next slide. Let me talk quickly about viruses. There's some important background to understand about viruses for everyone. The first one is that viruses do not live on a surface. The only way a virus can be truly alive is inside a host cell. It needs to infect someone's cells to reproduce and become alive in that sense. When viruses are on surfaces, they are dormant, they may be infectious, but they are not alive in the sense of growing and reproducing. Viruses generally are categorized in two ways. They can either have a majority of DNA in their core nuclei, or they can have RNA, a different type of protein, cellular protein. So once you've classified them into DNA or RNA viruses, we then look at issues like size, and I've got a micrograph there from a very old textbook from an Australian author by the name of Frank Fenner, Dr. Frank Fenner. And it categorises and shows you roughly the proportional size. And we've got a little micrograph towards the right that's a red and white colour bar that's the typically used COVID-19 representation from the CDC in Atlanta, Georgia. This COVID-19 virus is a medium-sized virus, around about 120 nanometers in size. So that's 12/1000th of the pointy end of a pin. Sorry, that's 12/1 millionths of the pointy end of a pin. And it's very small, but it's still bigger than some of the very small viruses. And you'll see a number on this slide, such as the picornaviruses or polioviruses. And those viruses are typically much more resistant, much more rigorous. They'll usually survive in watercourses, and typically they are much more infectious. This virus, the COVID-19 virus, is about mid-range. The red dots on the outside of the surface are the corona. The corona is in fact the crown. They aren't, it looks like it's rigid in this illustration, but in fact they're very floppy and loose. They're small pieces of protein that reach out from the virus with which it grabs hold of its target cells. Next slide, please. Now, one thing about viruses is, of course, they take advantage of the things we do as humans. And an important point to note is that we do lots of things to aid viruses. In hospitals, we generally don't have everybody covered up very well. If we get sick, typically we're not going to cough and splutter and the viruses become airborne. But then we also do things like touch our face between 20 and 40 times an hour. When we go to the bathroom, many people have got poor hand hygiene. And so lots of surfaces become contaminated. And one of the features of this virus is that about half of the people who are infected actually will be excreting the virus in their fecal material, that is in their poo. So if there's poor hand hygiene, straight away, everything in a bathroom is also contaminated. And of course, one of the things about the virus that's important to note is that the closer it is between people, the easier it is to infect. So at a recent wedding in March in New South Wales, there was a small private wedding, about 100 guests, and one person flew in specifically for that wedding. And unfortunately, that person was carrying the virus, was at that point asymptomatic. So they were spreading the virus pre-symptomatically. And from one infected person, 38 people were infected. Now, it's very close contact at a wedding. There's lots of hugging, and there's kissing, and there's handshakes, and there's eating together and drinking together and dancing and close personal contact. One person, 38 infections. And that speaks to how potentially infectious this virus is. Now, one thing I would note is that this virus has some interesting characteristics in terms of surface survival. It will survive quite a deal longer than, say, the original SARS-1. The original SARS-1 virus was quite labile and really wouldn't survive all that long on many surfaces. Whereas this new virus will survive, for example, on cardboard for up to 24 hours. Now, another important thing to note about this virus and the testing that's being done and some of the literature is there's some very good literature and there's some really bad literature out there, even in the peer review literature. And just last night, we had one letter to the editor, which was accepted for publication, criticising a very well-cited piece that was only published in January that's complete rubbish. One of the problems in cleaning this virus is that the testing that's being done is on pure virus. So it's like you get it in a lab, you grow it up, and then you purify it, and then you see how long it lasts. But in real life, that's not what happens. In real life, this virus is going to exist on inanimate surfaces in all sorts of places in the presence of all sorts of other bodily fluids. So there are certain things and places that are really very high risk. As an illustration of that, in one of the staterooms on the Ruby Princess, which was docked in Japan for about 21 days, 18 days after an infected patient left, they still recovered infectious virus from the surface of that stateroom. Now that's an ideal environment, stable humidity in, stable conditions, poor cleaning, most likely present inside a nice moistened droplet of mucus or nasal aspirates, ideal conditions for virus survival. Next slide, please. It turns out cleaning is a little bit more difficult than people think, and there's some really easy things to see. You know that if you're trying to clean your windscreen and your wipers aren't working or you've got frost and you try and wipe, actually you get this really terrible result. And you would think that cleaning in a context of even a hospital would be easy, but in fact, It's more difficult than people realise. There are at least 9 individual variables just for cleaning. It's quite complex. How fast you clean, what type of cloth, how much liquid, how many times you reuse that cloth on the same surface. And one of the problems we have is that if cleaning is not done correctly, all that happens is that the virus will move from surface to surface, place to place. We don't have time to go over all the literature at the moment, but there's a lot of literature as to how quickly things like microfiber can spread a virus from surface to surface to surface. And in fact, the same authors that I've got represented there in that little cartoon on the right about the factors impacting the outcome of a wiping action, one of them is Professor Jean-Yves Millard from the University of Cardiff, and he with Professor Sattar, who's an emeritus professor in Canada, have proven that if you want to wipe using cloths, then there's a simple principle to follow. You must use one wipe only. Use that wipe only on one surface, and you must use it only in one direction. Anything that's backwards and forwards will simply spread the virus on and off the cloth. Work we've recently published has shown that if the virus or the bugs are present in things like biofilms, then even after 50 wipes, you can find you've still only just removed 90% rather than 99.99 that we're trying to aim for. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that has been said globally is that cleaning is about the removal of unwanted soils and microorganisms. The goal of cleaning is removal. But in many contexts, we need to be sure that we're going to have things that work. And so in that way, we often also resort to disinfectants. In Australia, the regulator for disinfectants is the Therapeutic Goods Administration. They have quite strident legislative frameworks that cover the entirety of the Australian territories. There is a strict regulatory regime, and for claims against COVID-19, the products must be in what's called included on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. The manufacturing conditions must be controlled, and every individual claim must be individually approved by the TGA under Therapeutic Goods Order 104. Now, you are allowed to use surrogate viruses. We use murine hepatitis virus in Australia. Human coronavirus 229E is another commonly used virus. These are all hospital-grade disinfectants with additional claims. Now, we are aware from a public health point of view, there are lots of products out there making what are in fact bogus claims. There's lots of fogging materials. There's lots of UV light and ozone and a whole range of products which frankly have no evidence, are unapproved, and are strictly illegal in the Australian context if they're making claims. That's important for people who are managing safety to know that, because if you're going to use something that is untried, untested, and without evidence, and without legal approval, you're probably doing something that gives you a quite severe and strict liability. Also in this area, just as a point of note, any advertising of products with a coronavirus to COVID-19 claim, they are strictly prohibited from advertising to consumers. In fact, every individual advertisement has to be literally approved by the TGA word for word. So there's quite strict issues in that area. And the other thing to quickly note is that hand sanitizers can't by law put virucidal claims on their labels. So there are two types of hand sanitizers. There are TGA approved ones and non-TGA approved ones. If you want certainty, you go to the TGA approved products. Unfortunately, with the global supply chain interruptions, they're a bit hard to come across at the moment. They're mainly being supplied into healthcare. But there are lots of other good quality products with instant hand sanitizers. The alcohol ones should contain at least 60% of alcohol. There are other products that may be efficacious, but you'll need to ask manufacturers for evidence. Next slide, please. Now, when you're using a disinfectant, there are a couple of key points to remember. The first one is disinfectants don't work by remote control. They need to have direct contact with the organism. So if you're not using enough product, or if you're not doing cleaning first and the virus is actually protected inside some saliva or other cellular materials, then the disinfectant simply won't work. The second thing is you need to give disinfectants time. Alcohol's a terrific disinfectant for bacteria. It works almost instantaneously, as do phenols on bacteria. But when it comes to viruses, the mode of action is slightly different. And even with alcohol, you need to have enough time. And the third thing is you need the right temperature. As we move into the colder months, typically for a disinfectant, for every 5 degrees drop, you should double the length of recommended time. The other thing to point out about disinfectants is there's also a trade-off. Usually you can only get 2 points on the triangle. And let me use water as an example. Water's got terrific efficacy against disinfectants when it's boiling. It's wonderful in the environment. But if you put boiling water onto all sorts of plastics and materials or onto electrical goods, you'll generally electrocute yourself or destroy the materials. And that's an example of how compatibility is a problem. Chlorine, similar. Great efficacy at the right strength, but it definitely needs to have pre-cleaning, but it's quite corrosive. Likewise with quaternium-ammonium biocides, generally they're going to be quite safe to use. The compatibility is good, but as a typical answer, they won't kill the worst kill bugs. Now, in the case of coronavirus, actually there are plenty of quats that will kill the coronavirus. In America, there are literally hundreds approved. Next slide, please. Now, the problem we have with coronaviruses, as you probably all know, is they are very small and you can't see them. And that typically is a problem for people who are doing cleaning. You can't actually see what you're cleaning. The viruses are too small. And that raises the whole quality assurance issue about how you measure cleanliness. Next slide, please. Now, there are ways to measure cleanliness now. There are different methods that you can do. There are 2 basic approaches. The first thing is that the cleaning process is a process, and therefore the sort of measures you're going to use are really efficiency measures. There are some tools out there, things like fluorescent markers. There's very good evidence as to them working well in the literature. There are at least a couple of brands in Australia. The second thing is that the cleaning process should give you a clean surface. And that requires a quantitative measure, a measure of efficacy. And there are a couple of indicator tools out there. The gold standard is, of course, in this case, virology. But those tests are really not available. They are difficult and they take lab time. It's not really practical. Similarly, bacteriology takes lab time. There are lots of ATP-related tools out there. They're not a bad indicator, but you need to be aware that ATP will not measure virus present because the viruses don't have sufficient ATP intracellularly to actually trigger an ATP response. But as an indicator for cellular contaminants, such as bodily fluids, nasal aspirates, cough material, other body materials that turn up in high-touch areas, ATP is a pretty good surrogate. Our next slide, please. I think that's probably all I need to do. I want to note these acknowledgements, my collaborators and research organisations, and I hand back to your facilitator. Thank you, Mark.
Excellent. Thank you, Greg, and really insightful, particularly in understanding the actual dynamics of a virus and why it is therefore so difficult to both find and then clean efficiently. Now, I believe there's a number of questions that have come in, Greg, that relate to what you have just talked about. So I'm going to hand you over to Rod Cameron, who will ask you some questions in regard to what you've just said. Thank you, Rod.
Thanks, Mark. Greg, yeah, look, we've had a few questions. The first one is, what does deep clean mean, and what should be the trigger for that to occur?
Yeah, deep clean is a funny term. It's jargon that has actually no definitional boundaries. There's no definition for what is a deep clean. In the medical area, we talk about terminal cleaning. That's pretty well defined, particularly in healthcare. And that basically means that you go in after a patient has left and you clean literally every surface. Now, when people talk about a deep clean, they're usually meaning that they're going to thoroughly clean all surfaces. It's important to note that if you are going to do a thorough clean, then you should particularly focus on the surfaces that are touched regularly. They are particularly at risk because people touch them with their hands and then have the risk of touching themselves, their face, and self-inoculating the virus that's on the surface. Typically, by the way, this virus and other bacteria, once you touch it on a surface, it will stay on your hands. If you've touched a large volume of it, it will stay on your hands for up to 19 subsequent touches. So hand hygiene for cleaning stuff is really important, but deep clean really is a bit meaningless. We're really talking about thorough cleaning.
Right, and one more question. Given that there's a shortage of some cleaning chemicals, is there an alternative product that people can use? And Kevin has suggested, or some of his workers have suggested, metho and water. Can that be used?
Well, first of all, there's no shortage of cleaning chemicals. I'm not sure where that's coming from, and there are some supply chain issues in regard to the presence of hand sanitizers and certain high-level disinfectant molecules, but generally cleaning products are widely available. You need to pick a good quality one. Metho is not a cleaning solution. In fact, it does exactly the opposite. Methylated spirits causes all the proteins to congeal onto a surface. So rather than cleaning things with methane, you actually fix the proteins in place. And if there's virus held inside those groups of proteins, it will be untouched. So you actually don't achieve anything with metho and water. In terms of cleaning, there are lots of choices. You should pick what suits the application you're requiring. Generally, we use the illustration that if you want to kill a fly, use a fly swat, not a hand grenade. Stronger does not mean better. What you should be doing is thorough cleaning, and that's the most important thing to focus on.
Might just squeeze one more in. I think people seem comfortable around the hard surfaces. What about cleaning carpet and soft furnishings? What's the best?
Great question. So let me put them in two categories. The first category is soft furnishings on the floor. But they should just be routinely cleaned. Unless you're going to routinely drop things on the floor and pick them up and eat them straight away, the floor is a very low risk item in the context of this virus, unless you're in a patient room. Now, even in a house, the carpet is a low risk issue, and really what you should be doing is doing something that was deep, hot water extraction would be typical. But then there are other soft furnishings that you touch. Chairs, lounge chairs, for example, the back of a chair. Those items should probably be disinfected properly with a disinfectant that's registered. And if at all possible, they should also be subject to hot water extraction cleaning. Most commercial contractors can do hot water extraction cleaning. The cleaning chemical is less important than the disinfectant. It's one of the rare times where you would disinfect first, then clean, simply because you want to make sure you've killed any surface virus before you put the cleaners at risk. The reason for that is when you're doing soft furnishings, particularly if you're going to do vacuuming, you run the risk of aerosolizing particles. And of course, if the virus is present in large volumes, the virus will be aerosolized with those particles, in which case the workers will be inhaling aerosolized droplet particles containing the virus. That's certainly an issue for cruise ships, and one of the issues of concern is how they've been doing cleaning on cruise ships, because if all they're doing is vacuuming, they're suspending particles with the virus. We've got friends in the US who are actually currently researching that issue at multiple universities, looking specifically at virus resuspension through poor cleaning technique.
Right. Thanks, Greg. We might hand back to you, Mark.
Great, thank you. And Greg, thank you very much. Really insightful. And if people would like to pursue further conversation, at the end of the webinar, you'll be able to find various contact details to pursue the conversation. Well, it's great to have Dusty Bennett with us. As I previously mentioned, Dusty is the Principal Hygienist at GCG. He has extensive experience working in occupational hygiene. He's a full member of the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists and has worked in mining, oil and gas, chemical, construction and manufacturing. Welcome, Dusty. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Just to add to that brief introduction of myself, I'm a certified occupational hygienist, or COH, which is the highest technical grade within the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists, or AIOH, just to have some more acronyms. And that body, AIOH, I'm proud to be a part of for 17 years now, since starting my professional career in occupational hygiene. And Mark and the team have asked me to provide some insights from an occupational hygienist perspective in working with the pandemic, which is relatively new for our profession, as well as the rest of industry who are putting in place controls to protect their workers. So I'd like to focus on some of the consistent learnings that I've been observing in relation to cleaning for COVID. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So first, it'd be remiss of me to probably just reset, and similar to what Greg has also talked about as well, is that there really is a primary control method in place, which is to manage that close contact to infected persons. And I'm really pleased to say that in my experience in going around to different workplaces all over, I'm not travelling at the moment so much, but all over the Brisbane region, we are seeing that workplaces are adhering to that, and I'm pleased to say that my peers and team members are also seeing that same adherence as well. And assuming that we have those primary controls in place, we then fall back onto a suite of secondary infection control principles, and namely hand hygiene and sanitising surfaces, similar to what Greg has mentioned previously. And that's important because hands in particular are a common transfer point of the virus into a body, and via the mouth, nose and eyes. But considering the current state of COVID-19 here in Australia right now, we're seeing businesses take stock after the initial crisis management phase, and have got in place the primary controls, and are looking now to start to validate their secondary controls to ensure they've got a safe workplace for their employees. And if we can go to the next slide, please, it'll help to illustrate some of the reasons that I'm a strong advocate for validating the effectiveness of these new controls. So in considering some of the recent workplace lessons, I'm going to focus on more of our experiences in the proactive or preventative side, instead of that reactive or deep clean, like Greg mentioned as well. And I'm certainly seeing more cleaning as better cleaning perspective from workplaces, and we're seeing that double, quadruple in response to COVID-19. And although there's clearly additional time required to clean, we know from Greg that more is not always better. In addition, we also need to take into consideration the potential exposure to the cleaning personnel who are doing that work, not only for COVID, but also for the other workplace hazards that may exist, including the chemicals that they are using for disinfection. For those of you, I get asked this a lot about where do I go for guidance, and I think if you can look at some keywords and search reputable sources, particularly government websites, for environmental cleaning is a very common one, or non-healthcare environmental cleaning, as traditionally most workplaces are external to the healthcare setting. And there's some really, really great content on there to help drive your programs around those porous surfaces or hard surfaces as well. So once you have that right cleaning guidance, it's then important to ensure a risk-based process to target those high-touch areas in particular. So where people are transiting through, they're going to touch those areas. And there's some simple grading tools that can help in this instance, just to help support your risk-based process. So simply grading how often people are going to touch those locations, it will help to dictate how often you're going to clean those areas using that risk principle. In terms of disinfectant chemicals, this is where I'm seeing a lot of confusion, and I'm really, really glad to see Greg on prior talking about some of the processes you have to go through to get approval through TGA to actually have a chemical that is effective in neutralising neutralising the viability of those viruses. But we're still seeing a lot of confusion in that place. I'd love to see some more support from that in terms of which chemicals to use. But in terms of adding some other clarity to this, the other part that I would just like to raise on the back of Greg's comment is that although a lot of the products we're seeing have some bogus claims, we also have a lack of insight as to what the active ingredient is within the chemical or what the chemical makeup is, because a lot of times it doesn't trigger the need to register those chemicals on the SDS, the safety data sheet, because they're not triggering the hazardous classification. So I would advocate, similar to what Greg mentioned as well, is to go back to the manufacturer of those chemicals and rely on good quality manufacturers to have a conversation if you don't have that information at hand, and find out what is the active ingredients and which of those may present a significant risk to the cleaning personnel, particularly if you're using more concentrated products. Adding to the cleaning process, and to mirror Greg's sentiments as well, this is probably the most critical phase and something that we see a lot of failures in workplaces currently. Some experiences probably to share from my perspective here is we are universally seeing mixing of chemicals, so using a concentrate and diluting that down perhaps outside of manufacturer specifications. Also seeing some chemicals being mixed together, some bleach-based solutions and quaternary ammonium-based solutions as well. That can have a toxic off-gassing, which can present a risk to the workers doing that. It also can neutralise that disinfectant property, so we're just sort of rubbing expensive water across the surfaces. I do almost always see this not degreasing of surfaces, so not taking the biofilm off of surfaces to enable that disinfectant to be effective, or to clean those surfaces so that those particles don't become re-entrained and get back into the air. And I appreciate it's difficult to see, but there's a picture of a microwave there with a nice glossy surface that you can, if you get a torch, you can see, and it's just a helpful, simple tool to give feedback to yourself and the cleaners to make sure you're sort of getting some visual validation of your cleaning regime. Also seeing bleach-based solutions being mixed and then put in, held outside and in the sun, particularly in construction type environments where storage can be difficulty, and that will also neutralise that chemical, that disinfectant property over time, and that happens quite rapidly. In relation to worker traceability, this for me is a really valuable tool to have in conjunction with your preventative controls. And once you have a case, it really helps to be able to map that back against your cleaning, your disinfection regime, to give confidence that that's actually provided some comfort factor and that hazard is being managed. So for me now is probably the time, given our timeline, to do some scenario planning about what would happen if someone called in today, if you haven't already had that occur, and what would we do and how would we provide some confidence to ourselves and to workforce about have our controls been effective, and what would we do in response to that and where we would clean. Moving on to PPE, this could be discussed at length and it is really a topic on its own right, but principally selecting PPE must be based on the risk to worker health, but is likewise for any other hazard that we encounter where we need to use PPE. But please focus on reputable advice from government sources, as well as the manufacturers, reputable manufacturers of those devices, as well as some technical associations also. As needed, you can always seek advice from a qualified occupational hygienist. As I mentioned earlier, AIOH, the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists, is a good source to identify people that may be able to assist here. And respirators are definitely known to be effective in preventing inhalation risk from viruses, but I have to be really clear, it's not as simple as buying a respirator and slapping it on or handing it out to the workforce. There's an Australian standard 1715 which has some really critical elements contained within that need to be adhered to. And without that, we see time and time again that control is failing with respirators in particular. And I often see in fit testing people, which is a critical part of that Australian standard, your failure rates of north of 70% of people who are given a respirator that it doesn't actually fit them correctly and it isn't working properly. And more recently, unfortunately, in the two images in the bottom right there, we're actually seeing a real influx of counterfeit products. Our profession's helping to flag some of those and to seek some qualification from manufacturers or suppliers in Australia. But we can see that both those two products have got a 3M badging of 8210, but one of those is counterfeit. And even from my experience in occupational hygiene in industrial environments of using respirators an awful lot, even I would find it difficult to find out which one. So for me, definitely sticking to the reputable brands and querying which respirators you've got in place and checking the certification against the sister of AS 1715, which is AS 1716 that they need to meet, and you can see that label on there. If we can go to the next slide, please. I sort of wanted to focus also on now the exposure risk to cleaners. And it's important to note that we're seeing a change from normal conditions and practices for our cleaning staff in the workplace. So their risk profile needs to be reconsidered in light of that. In addition to the obvious COVID-19 infection control risk for cleaners, there's obviously an exposure risk to chemicals. And not only are we seeing along the duration of chemical exposure, we're seeing some different application methods. And like Greg mentioned, we're seeing fogging applications as well, where we're having much higher concentrations of those chemicals potentially contacting the body or being inhaled into the system and potentially causing an adverse health effect. So from a normal use of cleaning products, we also know that there have been some adverse health effects raised for cleaning personnel, and most commonly skin dermatitis and irritation to the eyes and upper respiratory tract. We can see some disorientation depending on the type of chemical and respiratory irritations. But there is also some evidence of long-term exposure to chemicals from cleaners and lung disease occurring. So I would implore businesses to go about applying a balanced risk-based process and making sure that is being reviewed for cleaners and not just the workplace staff. A lot of sites have cleaners externally engaged. So partnering with them to ensure that those risks are being catered for, but also validating the efficacy of the work that they're doing in cleaning and the risks that they have in place, the controls that they have in place to manage their own risks. If we can go to the next slide, please. In closing, I'd just like to circle back on some of the key points. And although the priority is managing close worker contact, cleaning can definitely assist in minimising transmission from surfaces, and focusing on supporting and validating that change in cleaning processes have really been invaluable in my experience, and getting down to the worker level and actually observing that. Greg mentioned there is some tools to be able to support that validation process, including using ATP meters. They're an instantaneous kit. They certainly have been valuable to give that insight to cleaning personnel and to workplaces. And although respirators are a valid control, it is essential. It is really essential to ensure that they are actually protecting workers as designed by following Australian Standard 1715. But I'd also like people to be conscious of current supply challenges and potential impacts to those who are essential workers who need that PPE most, and take a bit more of a real risk approach rather than a highly conservative approach. And businesses should also ensure that there is a safe system of work in place, and it's balanced not only for COVID, but for the other health hazards that may be introduced or present now, or introduced from the new practices that have come about post COVID. And there is specialist advice that can be sought from institutes like the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygiene and the AIHS. Respectfully, those institutes have highly technical people that can assist in validating those risks and making sure that they're appropriate for the business or the workplace. And in closing, in fine-tuning your infection control fundamentals and then validating those, it clearly has provided some confidence in COVID-19 controls and those who need to manage that risk, including those who are working in that space with cleaners. But if I can now put myself in the shoes of the risk owner, the real test here for me is, could I stand up in front of the workforce and put my hand on my chest and be confident that those controls are actually protecting worker health? So I think as we're afforded this time in this current timeline for COVID, right now, it's now about validating those controls, checking that they are working and getting some evidence so that you do have confidence to be able to stand up there and portray that to the workforce and yourselves as the duty holders. That's all I have for now, and back to you, Mark. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dusty, and really very helpful in the way that you've tied together, building off Greg's view around cleaning efficacy and then looking at proceduralising that and exposure to cleaners. Dusty, we're going to come back to you in a moment with some questions, but I thought we might move on to Rochelle and to Jamie. Both of them will now bring, I suppose, part of how they're responding to the challenge at an organisational level, and two very large organisations in Woolworths and Spotless. Rochelle is the Group Health and Safety Manager for Woolworths. She's been in that role for nearly 4 years now and has been at the front line of working within Woolworths to support and respond to COVID-19, and certainly has dealt with a number of the challenges of hygiene, social distancing and cleaning. And also Rochelle brings a really important background, both in terms of a business leader with an MBA and also a nursing background. So welcome, Rochelle. Really looking forward to hearing your contribution. We'll then ask you some questions, and then we'll circle to Jamie, and then finally come back to you, Dusty, for some questions. So over to you, Rochelle.
Thank you, Mark, and it's really great to be here today. So thank you for inviting me to talk about how do we practically apply all of that information within a workplace. And for us, it's about not only our team members, but customers and members of the public that are actually coming into these environments and trying to balance the needs of all of those different stakeholders. And I think it's fair to say that, this is something that we're learning as we go, and we've been adapting. If I think back over a month ago now, when we were first talking about COVID and cleaning, it was all around what do we do if we do have somebody with the virus in one of our sites. And people were picturing sending everybody home, evacuating the workplace, closing it down, bringing in the hazmat team, and doing all of the detailed cleaning. And I think we've learnt a lot since then, and now have been able to look at how do we then practically manage that. And for us, it's been about making sure we're getting our advice from some of those trusted sources. So using Department of Health, using some of the government agencies to not only help inform us, but also to make sure our teams have access to that same information as well. A lot of people are seeing feedback from social media and all sorts of sources, some of which is not helpful. And it's been really important for us to make sure that we're able to give them the most up-to-date and current information around that. We've been lucky enough to also sit on a government task force for supermarkets to seek their advice, but also work together around what type of hygiene measures, cleaning, etc. is required. And as an organisation who needs to continue working as an essential services to provide food and groceries to the community, we can't afford not to do something. Otherwise, we just will not be able to trade. Also looking at feedback from team members and customers, because they also are pretty open with giving us their views around what they believe is safe and what's not, and what sort of things that they're looking for when they do come into some of our stores. And then also internationally. So we've been able to connect in with retailers overseas, some of which have been ahead of the experience for us here, and pick up what's actually worked for them. And I guess for us, cleaning was something very early on. So hygiene and cleaning were the first things that we were looking at. And then we've evolved into other things such as social distancing and other measures to put into the programs within the stores. And we already had a comprehensive daily clean in our sites. We already had contract cleaners that are in our stores every day doing cleaning. So for us, it was about understanding what are those highly touched or frequently touched surfaces that we needed to pay more attention to. So one of the first things we did was understand what they were within the environment, and then looked at implementing what we're calling sort of the high touch cleaning or proactive cleans. So we now have contractors in our stores continually cleaning all of the time. And then we also have cleaning that we do if we have had a confirmed case, whether that's a customer that's been in one of our stores or whether it's a team member. And I'll share in a minute just some of the learnings as how that's played out. But probably when we talk about cleaning, for me, it's one part of what we do, because coming into contact with, virus on surfaces is one part, but it's also around the face-to-face contact that our team members and customers may also have with each other. And I guess we're fortunate in terms of the environment that, we're not in a situation where we are face-to-face with customers or team for 15 minutes or more, or in that closed-in environment. So the nature of people walking up and down the aisles is less of a risk than somebody in a confined area. We've been told that the risk in surfaces is a lower risk for us. But what we've found with where we have had a person confirmed is sometimes it's 3 or 4 days after that person actually did receive a diagnosis that we may find out that they were in one of our sites. So the question is then what type of level of cleaning do you actually do when that happens? And we have used terms such as the deep clean or the comprehensive clean. And that has been about bringing in cleaners and thoroughly cleaning each of those different surfaces. Interestingly enough, the advice that we've received from some of the government task force has been that there isn't any additional extra cleaning that they see is required after a confirmed case. They believe that the current cleaning regimes that are in place are sufficient. However, our decision around cleaning is both risk-based, but also around perception-based, around what do our teams expect, or what would our customers expect if something like that had happened. So that's driven us in terms of what we've also put in place. So you will see increased cleaning if we do have a site that's been identified, even if it has been 4 days after that person visited the sites. In some cases, we can use CCTV and other things at our disposal to be able to see where people have worked. We've got our login details of teams, etc. And one of the things that we've done really well, I think, is help provide our team information around what that means, so that if something does happen and there's been somebody in the store, they know how to respond and they're not panicking. And that's really helped in terms of the team response. But going back to just the regular cleaning, and you can see on the slide that we have guidelines that cover both the personal hygiene, our store hygiene where there's cleaning, and then other safety information. Because cleaning is just one part, and we can't practically clean every single surface every time somebody touches something, whether that's the box of cornflakes that are coming through the registers, or whether that's the keypads or pin pads or trolleys. But what you'll see is things that we've put in place. So the hygiene stations, both the team and customers, with hand sanitizer. Again, it's about, after you've touched a surface, it's about not touching your face. So making sure that we're supporting our strategies in that space. What's also been important for us is visibility. So customers are telling us that they feel more comfortable when they see some of the cleaners with the high-vis vests and the cleaning material on them, because it gives them that sense of, you've got people in there, you are cleaning, it is regular and it's visible. So that's been an important learning for us as well. So all of those visual cues, just as important as actually completing the cleaning task. We are making sure that we are looking at other risks that cleaning and hygiene has introduced, whether it's through use of hand sanitizer or chemicals, etc., to make sure that people have the right PPE for those things. And I guess for us moving forward now, it's trying to understand what's the new normal. So is this now what we will do moving on? We don't know when this will end, and COVID today, but could be something else tomorrow. So for us, it's about continually understanding what the right chemicals process, what's the most effective, what level of frequency and how often we should be cleaning that provides the best result, and providing that education to our teams around what does work and how we can put these sorts of things into our normal practice now. I think a lot of these things will be here to stay moving forward, just based on the feedback and demand from customers. So that's cleaning and a few other things for Woolworths. Thanks, Mark.
Excellent. Thank you, Rochelle, and really helpful the way that you've provided the risk framework in how decisions are being made. And I thought it was really interesting the consideration of stakeholders being not only staff but also customers, and the importance of not only risk-based but perception-based decision making, and how you're actually looking at how does this become maybe somehow the new normal, and really challenging, you know, and trying to align also then with what is the known scientific evidence and government advice. So I'm going to hand over to you, Rod. I believe there are some questions for Rochelle. So thank you, Rod.
Thanks, Mark. Rochelle, we've got a question from Ravi. He wants to know whether it's okay to use the company's own employees if there's a positive case. Do you have some ideas in terms of how you've treated that at Woolworths?
Yeah, sure. It was something early on that we asked, but also fairly quickly made a decision that we would use our contract cleaners for that purpose. And that was for a number of reasons. One, we already had a lot of our contract cleaners already engaged. They actually are used to doing this as a living, and had also the right PPE and equipment that would be needed to complete it properly. Our team members have been under some, you know, enormous sort of change and pressure with COVID around whether it's the aggressive customers in sites, as well as some of the fatigue of just sort of working really hard through the panic buying phases, and actually coming to grips with their own hygiene and how we'd manage social distancing in stores. So we've tried to make sure that we've used roles that are actually familiar with the process, and made a decision then to use the guys that do this for a living.
Great, thanks. And do you also, how many of the new processes do you think, you know, customers might require to stay in place going forward? Are people getting used to seeing this much cleaning happening?
It's an interesting one. I don't think we've got the answers yet. We are seeing some things slow down now in the Australian context. For me, it'll be some hygiene and sanitisation stations, things like that, I believe will now be part of what we do. And from the cleaning place, yeah, not too sure. We've always provided things like trolley wipes and things like that for customers to utilise as part of their shop, so they will remain. But yeah, the level and the frequency of the cleaning, I think we'll just continue to assess as again, we learn more about its effectiveness and the place that it has in what's the new normal.
Great, thanks, Rochelle. I think in the interest of time, I'll hand back to you, Mark.
Great, thank you. And thank you again, Rochelle, really helpful. Well, our last presenter for today's webinar is Jamie Ross. Jamie's the head of Zero Harm at Spotless Services. And he was previously the Director of Health and Safety at Rail Projects Victoria. And he also brings a mining background. He was the Head of Safety, Risk and Security for Newcrest Mining. So Jamie, really looking forward to hearing what Spotless has been learning in terms of cleaning for COVID-19. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Next slide there, or first slide, thanks. Yeah, I'd like to take the time today to add a bit of the Spotless perspective of what we're currently dealing with, and also really add that layer that Rochelle's already started to go into quite a bit of detail about what they're doing there, with how we want to have the sustainability over time to really make sure we achieve those two. For us, there's two objectives. One is obviously to make sure that the cleaning is effective and stays effective over time, and there's a number of reasons why that might erode as we go forward. And the second one is obviously not only do you want things to be clean, but you want your employees and in some cases the public, for us, to feel like things are clean. So how do we make sure we're achieving those two things in the short term, and then over time with the organisational perspective to it. So right at the moment, Spotless has really got three categories of cleaning that we're heavily involved with and have been for many weeks now. We've got obviously our internal site cleaning, our own facilities and our own equipment, and the continual cleaning that's going on there. That's some of the photos on the left. In the centre, we've got a large number of people who have been redeployed quite rapidly, particularly in a partnership with the Melbourne City Council, to clean public areas. So rail stations, trams, things like that. So we got a lot of people out in the environment. They've been redeployed from other parts of the business, and they're doing that ongoing continual cleaning in those public spaces. And thirdly, we've got our infected areas cleaning, so the 2-stage with the cleaning and then the disinfecting or the sanitizing. So that very thorough cleaning that we're having to do in our client premises and also in some of our own premises. So each of those comes with a different set of purposes for what you're trying to achieve, and also a different set of risks. Risks for the individuals doing the cleaning, and risks that that cleaning is not as effective as we'd like it to be. Next slide, thanks. So while we want to, you know, when we set these things up in the first place, we made sure we had the right advice, the right procedures, the right equipment, the right chemicals, and large parts of our business are contracted cleaners, so we do have the experience within the business. But as we go forward, what we want to think about is how do we influence the behaviours that we want, so that after that initial hump of excellence, where everyone's very diligent, very vigilant, understands what they're doing, you know, we can retain that and it doesn't erode over time. So there's really 2 sets of behaviours we want to influence. The first one is for our workers coming back to work or staying at work. And also this applies to the public, where we're cleaning in public spaces. And obviously the behaviours we're looking for there is that they're coming into a clean work environment and they've got an understanding of the cleaning that we're doing. And really that understanding has to have the eventual outcome of they've got confidence. They've got confidence that their workplace is clean. And if they're coming back, they've got that confidence to come back and they understand what's being done. We're really achieving that through a number of ways. One is the constant communication and making sure that our workforce, not the cleaners, but the people working in these environments, understand some of the 101 that we heard at the start of the webinar, understand how viruses are cleaned, and then understand what Spotless is doing. So they have that good understanding of how we're managing the risk, but also backing that up with some of the great stuff that Rochelle showed, the visual indication or the visual cues. So it's very important that the cleaning is actually effective, but it's also important that the cleaning is perceived as effective. So we want our employees in the workplace and the public in the public environments to be able to look around somehow and be able to get that feel or that smell that things are being cleaned on an ongoing basis to give them that confidence. Next slide, please. And then obviously our second part is the behaviours of the cleaning folks themselves. So clearly there's all the upfront piece around lots of training. So we have a lot of cleaners in our business who are continuing to do this for clients and being redeployed to other parts of the business. But also then we've supplemented that. So we've got a lot of components of our organisation that have been significantly shut down, and we've been able to redeploy those people to assist with cleaning. So we put in place a detailed training program, made sure they understood the procedures and all the potential issues with that could result in non-effective cleaning. But again, that's going to help, you know, on their first day, their second day, when they're super vigilant, and you know. But as we roll on longer term, and particularly as the environment changes in the world, and we start relaxing some things, or you know, it feels like there's less cases, there's that real risk that the diligence of cleaning goes down. If I've been going around train stations and tram stops in Melbourne now for 6 to 8 weeks, wiping down the same stuff, how do you make sure that I maintain the effectiveness of that cleaning? And this is where the organisational and the leadership piece comes in. How do we make sure that they keep the diligence in the cleaning, and also the diligence particularly in their personal protection from a PPE standpoint and a hand cleaning at the end of the shift? So what we've been doing around that is really trying to engage this as a very important task for our whole organisation, and engage the leadership like we would with any other kind of activity that we do to get a quality outcome and obviously a safe and healthy outcome. We've made sure that supervisors and our leadership teams understand the importance of cleaning, understand what the right procedures are. And then what we've been able to do is back that in, next slide, thanks, with a support and a coaching and a checking mechanism. So we've built on a tool that we already had using a pretty simple online platform that's available. And we've got our leaders mobilised to go out in the field and be helping to both obviously support and ask if our cleaning staff need assistance or help, but also do the checks, do the critical control checking with our folks, and make sure that for each step in the process that they should be following, whether that's your daily continual touch point cleaning or your 2-phase full disinfectant cleaning, that that we are reminding and reinforcing what the correct behaviours are at all those steps. And then putting that all into some kind of dashboard, the dashboard example that you see on the screen there, that's being able to fly up through the organisation, much in the way of the rest of our systems, but get that engagement and ownership right up the tree. So this is seen as an important activity, and it's reinforced and it's supported, so that as we go forward, our quality of our cleaning and our quality of our communications around our cleaning doesn't erode over time. So far we're getting really good feedback on how that's working. We're also getting very good feedback. Our cleaners in the public environment really like being out there. They get a lot of thanks and appreciation from members of the public walking around. But also what we're learning by having the visibility of how well we're doing is we're able to do that continual course correction over time and make sure that we keep that quality for ourselves and our own staff, for the public, and importantly for our clients. Thanks, Mark. That's a short summary of where we're at Spotless and some of the things we're putting in place.
Great. Look, thank you, Jamie. That's excellent. And again, I think each presenter has built a really helpful picture. So you've brought the issue of people's concerns, both for those returning to a workplace, Jamie, and for those who are cleaning it. And how do you focus on leadership and values and keep people focused over an extended period of time? Really helpful insights. I'm going to hand to Rod now. And Rod's got some questions for yourself, Jamie and Dusty, and then I'll conclude today's webinar. To you, Rod.
Thanks, Mark. Jamie, just one question for you. Obviously, people are interested in understanding how Spotless tackles, big areas, large areas. Can you give us some insight into how you deal with those large areas practically in the field?
Yeah, so we've got our ongoing cleaning in extremely large areas, both our facilities, some of our large hospitality facilities, and our public locations, and then in fact very large and high operations like in our laundries. So I guess the focus has been on making sure that we've got sufficient folks there with sufficient training, but then that they understand that they work methodically. And again, what we expect to find is when someone is mobilised to clean, they've done their training, they've received the procedure, they've been shown the key touch points to clean. Their first day is going to be 110%, their second day is going to be 109, 108, 107. But like any ongoing task, you can expect to get some erosion, and particularly with this one where you have a pretty good assumption that what you're cleaning is virus free anyway. So how do you avoid that complacency and make sure that people stay methodical? And obviously we're trying to do that through the leadership engagement activity that I spoke about at the end there, but also through rotating people around to the different locations, so there's that variety, and keeping strong communication with those folks so that in a month or 2 months time their important work doesn't become perceived as being kind of not quite so important work.
Great. Thanks very much, Jamie. Might move to Dusty. Just one question for you, Dusty, and then we'll probably have to wrap up. Both you and Greg mentioned fogging, and I'm just interested to understand, when is that appropriate to use, or is it not appropriate in treating this virus?
Yeah, thanks, Rod. It's certainly not a primary tool. We're looking at those high touch surfaces as really being the focal point of where you're going to pay attention for cleaning and using a disinfectant as well. And that's aligned to government advice that's reputable. So first and foremost, focusing on those areas, high touch locations, and a deep clean of those areas is first and foremost. And where we're seeing in the field, in different organisations, the use of fogging is happening potentially as a bit of a perception tool as well for the workforce to feel, to have that smell as well on the end, and that it smells clean as well. But it's probably more effective on those other surfaces that you're not going to do a primary clean. So curtains, the walls, it even goes into the air conditioning system for some of those applications as well, whereby it can reach those far-fetched areas and potentially provide some disinfectant to those as well. There has been some concerns raised in the past. I know CDC in America has put a question mark on fogging, and more recently provided some clarity that that validates that they can be useful in a disinfectant process. But certainly the efforts should be focused around those high touch locations where the workforce are going to spend their time and make contact with by far.
Great, thanks, Dusty. Look, there's lots more questions, but I think time has beat us, so I'll hand back to you, Mark.
Look, I just want to thank you, Rod, for sharing the questions with the panel. It's been a great webinar today. Really appreciate our panelists in Greg Whiteley, Dusty Bennett, Rochelle Mott, and Jamie Ross for joining us in what's been a really helpful conversation around the various complexities of cleaning for COVID-19, covering not only the science, but also systems, thinking about risk perception, risk-based decision-making, looking at how you manage the structure, what does a new normal look like in the future, and particularly around that of hygiene and values and leadership. So it's been great. So on behalf of the Australian Institute of Health and Safety and Art of Work, I thank you for joining today's webinar. On behalf of both organisations, we thank you, panel members.